There are also some people who see Tibet as a card. We don't hold it against you. We just say, play it well, please. Play it well. Don't squander it. Don't waste it. We are not only pawns in a great game. We are actors on a global stage.
This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Brevi. In our continuing analysis of Tibetan issues, we have with us Dr. Tenzin Dorjee. He's known as Tendor. He's considered among the leading voices for the Tibetan cause in the US. And we're also joined by Dorjee Tseten, who's a member of the exiled Tibetan Parliament in India and also a global campaigner for the Tibetan cause. Thank you both for finding time on this very short trip that you're here from the US for, Tendor, if I can call you that.
Yes,
since everybody does.
Yes.
But I wanted to start this interview with a little bit of personal touch about you and your background and you growing up in India, if you could tell us about that.
Sure. Yeah, I'm part of the second and third generation Tibetan refugees who grew up in India in exile. And my parents, they came from Tibet in the 1960s, late 50s, early 60s. There was a huge influx of refugees who came from Tibet after China's invasion of Tibet and escaping Chinese persecution. And they settled down in Kulu Manali, actually, one of the more beautiful valleys in Himachal. And that's where I was born and raised. My parents were teachers in a small Tibetan refugee school that's part of the Tibetan Children's Village Network. Mm-hmm. So that's how, I got my start in education, receiving an education in a Tibetan school. And then, from there, I attended school in Dharamsala later, finished my high school in India before immigrating to the United States.
Dorjee, you have a similar story that tens of thousands of Tibetans in India have. I think your parents came here initially straight after the invasion, like Tendor was talking about. A little bit about your life in India.
Similar to Tendor, my parents escaped 1959, and my family is from eastern part of Tibet, nomadic community, and when invasion happened, it was not possible for them, and for their security, they have to escape. So I was born in Himachal, in Bir. It's very famous for paragliding these days. So very close to Dharamsala. I had the opportunity to go to Tibetan school. So His Holiness Dalai Lama, the first thing he did when he came to exile was to build schools for the Tibetan community, refugee community. So that's how we had this opportunity to keep our culture, identity alive, at the same time have the oral education that we need, the modern education we need. Then I mostly spent my time in India, worked in Dharamsala for a short period of time. I went to US, New York, when I was the executive director of Students of Free Tibet. We had spokespeople, and right now, again, based in Dharamsala as a parliament member.
Since you got a lot of recent background in the US, tell us a little bit more about this Resolve Tibet Act and how it could change things, not only vis-a-vis US and Tibet, how the US and China are currently, but overall, globally as well.
Right. So there has been a great deal of celebration in the Tibetan community about this new bill, Resolve Tibet Act. And it's one of the most significant milestones, I think, for the Tibet movement. And this basically, it's the result of hard work by many Tibetan communities and many Tibetan organizations that are based in the United States. And this initiative was led by, the leadership was from the International Campaign for Tibet, which is one of the oldest, largest grassroots organizations based in the US working for Tibetan freedom and self-determination. And they took the leadership and basically, a lot of other groups, networks, and community. There's lots of Tibetan communities and associations that are based in the U.S. now. So all of them basically took part in the advocacy for this important legislation. And I want to give a little bit of a background in terms of the history of Tibetan legislation in the United States. And because I think the background will make us see more clearly why this is such a huge step. So we have 2002 Tibet Policy Act, right? And the dimension of that bill is mostly cultural, social support, some economic support, but mostly cultural, I would say. Then we have 2007, the Congressional Gold Medal for His Holiness. It was a huge step forward. At the same time, the recognition is largely symbolic for His Holiness, for his leadership in the global community, right? And then after that, we have 2018, a huge step forward, which is the reciprocal access to Tibet. And you know, in the Tibet movement and in our communities, we often like to complain to all sorts of governments that, you know, we appreciate your moral support, we appreciate your economic and social support, we appreciate the refugee assistance. We would love to see more political support. That's our eventual ultimate goal. And 2018, the reciprocal access to Tibet basically created sanctions. It slapped sanctions on Chinese leaders who are in charge of preventing Tibetan Americans with American passports from visiting Tibet to see their families, their aging parents. And that was a really important milestone. And I think that kind of set the stage for the potential for more hard-hitting, more concrete show of support for the Tibetan movement. And now the 2024 Resolve Tibet Act, what it does is it reopens the Tibet issue as an unresolved as an unresolved conflict. So it is not a closed chapter in history. Now it's an unresolved conflict designation. It also states that Tibetans have a right to self-determination. And that's a really important terminology in this bill, because Tibet is not just an issue of human rights. Because, you know, human rights is important, but to some extent it can also diminish the issue to individual rights. Whereas the Tibetan people have not only human rights, but they also have right to self-determination, which is a collective right as a people, as a nation, and that's a really significant language. Then it also states that Tibet means Tibet Autonomous Region plus Kham and Amdo, which is really important because the Chinese government has been very successful in cutting Tibet up into these different pieces, lumping some of them into Qinghai, some of them into Sichuan, right? And that's created a lot of confusion for the global community, for the media, for policymakers. And now this bill hopes to clarify that actually Tibet means all of historical Tibet that belongs to the Tibetan people, right? So those are some of the major new developments, new milestones that this bill carries forward. And it also commits resources to fighting or countering China's influence, and it will commit resources to the Tibetan community and the Tibetan movement to engage and take leadership in this particular role of countering the Chinese government's corrosive, negative influence, not just against the Tibetan community, but globally. Because right now, as Salman Rushdie said, the greatest threat to freedom, human rights, and democracy and free speech in the world is really the Chinese government.
Just taking up from Dorjee, in terms, we are still waiting for President Biden to sign it and make it law. And there's a lot of speculation in the media since the Dalai Lama is currently there recuperating successfully from his knee surgery, that possibly he meets him as well. And you know, the timing is such that the signing and the meeting happens. Speculation as of now, but it would be a big sign. But just about the act itself and how, in your view, geopolitics has changed. The US fueled China's rise in many ways after Nixon and Kissinger, right? Now it's because of geopolitics, there's a huge confrontation. But in your view, why is this act so important and not just symbolism, as Sundar is saying?
Before getting to that, you mentioned about His Holiness.
Yep.
We know that His Holiness treatment went very well. He's very healthy, and we are very happy for that. And recently, he has been moved from New York to like outside New York for the recovery. So the priority is His Holiness' health right now. Having said that, you have recently seen congressional delegation coming to Dharamshala.
And the Chinese reaction.
Yes, and it's a bipartisan delegation led by Congressman Michael McCall.
Nancy Pelosi.
And Pelosi, Speaker Pelosi was there. And you may have noticed that during Speaker Pelosi's speech, because she has been with Tibet movement for the longest time, very forefront supporting for Tibet. But she mentioned in her public event, I was there, that U.S. has finally clarity on Tibet issue. So what Tendor mentioned about that, I think, is very important. After years of failed policy that U.S. has adopted in terms of dealing with China, and for a very long time, because Tibet movement, of course, in the recent time, it get some attention, but it is one of the longest freedom struggle for the last 70 years. Most importantly, Tibetan inside Tibet has continuously reject China's occupation and resist, and for which we are standing in solidarity from outside and be their voice. So when Speaker Pelosi mentioned that U.S. has a clarity, what is that clarity? And we have time and again to all the people, government, that we cannot trust China. We said that. But unfortunately, many of the Western government put business above human rights, and they actually created China. Right now, globally, people are concerned, as Tendor mentioned. We are concerned in India with China's expansionist policy, what it's trying to do in the whole Himalayan belt. So that clarity is the engagement with China, thinking that China will change slowly, is a wrong policy. So now we have to stand up. So it is important for Tibet that recognizing Tibet as an occupied country and Tibetans having right to self-determination is, by the international law, our right as a collective right, as we discuss here. So that, I think, is very important. Now for India, especially, as with China's expansionist policy, we remember what happened in 2020 in Galwan, and right now the false claim that they tried to put on Arunachal, and they actually tried to make Arunachal as a conflict or disputed area, and in one way, many international medias are picking it. So now, with this bill, and we know that India has the legitimacy in terms of history, civilization, the moral, the religion, the culture that we have, the border, the politics, to speak up, to strengthen its position for Tibet. And it has been doing, we know that. But with this bill, which recognizes Tibet as an unresolved conflict and disputed, it strengthens India's position in dealing with China. So we think that it's a good opportunity for all of us and strengthen our position and have more coordinated work. So yeah, I want to say that in the beginning.
I like the idea that there should be more coordination between the oldest democracy in the world, that's the United States, the largest democracy in the world, that's India, and the smallest democracy in the world, that's the Tibetan government in exile.
I also wanted, since you've done a lot of work on the Chinese attempt to erase Tibetan culture from childhood, which is the Chinese boarding schools. If you could, in a nutshell, explain to our viewers the repression and oppression which is starting from that age and the indoctrination.
So what is well known so far is the Chinese government's attempt to convert Tibetans into Chinese, to eliminate or destroy Tibetan traditions, the Tibetan way of life, Tibetan language. They've made all of these attempts through a number of different policies over the course of 60+ plus years. And repeatedly, campaign after campaign, after the Great Leap Forward, after the Cultural Revolution, after the Western region development strategy of the 90s, they've tried everything and it's failed. And now, in kind of a admission of their failure, the Chinese government is now targeting children. You know, when you go for the children, when you turn the schools into battlefields, you are basically admitting that you have failed in your attempt to colonize Tibet, to conquer the Tibetan spirit, to break the Tibetan tradition and spirit, right? Or to break the Tibetan resistance against Chinese rule. And now this next chapter of China's policy, which is, colonizing the Tibetan mind, colonizing Tibetan children's mind through the instrument of education. Because education has a very good name. So they are turning education into a weapon of colonization, and it's a very, very sophisticated. We often talk about this, and we see this current policy as probably the most sophisticated colonial tool and also the most dangerous. And right now, from our research that's been done by Tibet Action Institute, what we know is more than 800,000 Tibetan students between the age of 6 and 18 have been put into these colonial-style residential schools. And these students have been basically stolen from their parents through coercive means and other illegitimate means. And now, in addition to that, one of the people who have recently escaped from Tibet, a Tibetan scholar, a very well-known Tibetan scholar by the name of Dr. Gallo, and his own research, he did field work inside Tibet for 5 years. And he traveled to so many places to talk to teachers, to talk to students, to talk to parents. And his own research has told us that at least more than 100,000 children who are between the age of 4 and 6 are in these boarding preschools. So it is not just above 6, but they're taking children below 6, and this is basically a playbook from the colonial era policies of 100 years ago, 200 years ago, what the Western European colonizers did to the indigenous communities in North America, in Australia. China is doing the exact same thing, but they're doing it with more resources. They're doing it with more money. They're doing it at a larger scale. And this is something that the entire world should be speaking up against right now, because this is probably the most dangerous tool that is basically choking the future of the Tibetan civilization and Tibetan children. So in terms of language destruction, language erosion, Tibetans inside Tibet are complaining the current policy is literally like cutting our tongue. That's how they are comparing this. And I think, we would love to see, I think that recently there has been more attention on this issue from India as well. And I think, from the Indian leadership side, as well as the United States, and now in Europe also, many governments are paying attention to this issue. In Geneva, I think if the international community spoke out and took action and condemned this policy and basically held China to account, I think there is still a possibility that this heinous genocidal policy can be reversed.
Dorjee, just the opposite in terms of India and Tibet. And I'm not just talking about post-independence, how India's helped Tibetans, but all through history. So when you look back to, say, Nalanda, when it was almost destroyed, all the documents and the thought was taken to Tibet to preserve. Subsequently, in other cases as well, like it's happening now, India is helping preserve the Tibetan cultural identity in India, at least for now, right?
So, as I mentioned earlier, after China's occupation, when they tried to destroy Tibetan identity and culture, and His Holiness coming to exile, building school, the monastic institution, actually there's a revival of that culture. We're able to revive from China's threat, and that happens in India, and it still continues. So I think there won't be any country, like no matter like whether US or anyone who are supporting, but there's nothing what India has done for us, which we are very, very grateful. In the same way, because of Tibet's occupation, the threat on India, direct threat, it's India which bear all the costs. And Tibet and India's relation, it's 1,000 years. It's not just right now what is happening in geopolitics. It's a people to people, the culture, the religion. That's why there is a huge respect. Every Tibetan, not just in exile, especially inside Tibet, even in the Buddhist script, India is mentioned as a land of intellectual, right? Where we, even in our the four, fathers, ancestors, they actually came to India to, seek the Buddhist philosophy
instead of China.
So that way, the relation goes beyond that, which is important. Adding to what Tendor mentioned in terms of the boarding school that China is implementing, the colonial boarding school, I think, as we agree, and a lot of people say that Tibet was a buffer state before China's occupation, and since China's occupation, China has come to India's border. I think Tibet is still a buffer state because the people inside Tibet, the civil resistance, which continues throughout, even now, right? And the people that inside Tibet, how they feel about India in terms of His Holiness, right? And the reason why Xi Jinping is implementing this policy where they had to force 4 or 5 year children to this boarding school, clarify that China still see Tibetans as a threat, and they didn't succeed to win the heart and mind of Tibetan people. That's why they feel threatened by 4 or 5 year children. So that is important. And I know that your program has covered, and we get to meet with a lot of Indian, expert, which discuss about the physical part of it, the border, the physical, the construction. But people sometimes they don't. I feel like they should think more about the people. So that's why it's important to speak up for those people who are right now suffering, who are actually the buffer, if we can see that way, and continue to resist. And as long as that resistance is there, for the Tibetan, there is a hope. And for India, there's a security. So why don't we invest in that? Why don't we stand up for that? So recently, when we had Universal Periodic Review in Geneva, you mentioned 20 countries spoke up. Japan from Asia, for the first time, specifically mentioned Tibetan. And those 20 countries were there. We think India can do more. India should also speak up there. That way, we are countering, the China's occupation and China's influence and threat, and we see ourselves as a partner in resisting, in protecting our freedom and democracy.
Tendor, you've been talking about resistance, and all of you have been resisting from outside Tibet and helping the cause. But before we started this interview, you did mention a little bit about how you managed to get back into Tibet and protest. So if you could tell us a little bit about that during the Olympics.
Sure, yeah. So remember, 2008 was when Beijing Olympics was held in China, and it was a very important occasion for the Chinese government because from a PR perspective, they knew that China and the Chinese government had a pretty bad reputation on the international stage because of their activities during the Cultural Revolution and also the Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989, its ongoing repression in Tibet. So China was really desperate to clean up its image in 2008, and they were trying to use the Olympics as a tool to get that job done. And for many of us in the Tibet movement, especially internationally, it was one of those moments where we had to step up and we said, okay, if we miss this opportunity, it'll be a huge loss to the movement. And we wanted to put the Tibet issue back into the media, into the global stage, because the media in 2006, 2007 was talking about the Chinese Olympics. They were talking about China's growth, economic success, miracles. They were talking about everything except human rights. They were talking about everything except Tibet. So I was at the time working at Students for a Free Tibet. I was part of the office in New York, the headquarters. And we came up, Students for Free Tibet organizes a lot of direct action. So we are very strong believers in nonviolent direct action. And we have, a huge grassroots network of people, mostly young people, who are willing to take part in nonviolent direct action. We've done lots of trainings, and that's where I got the opportunity, because I grew up in India, but then after I moved to the United States, within a few years, I became a citizen of the United States, and I had just acquired a new American passport. And I knew that the American passport comes with a little bit of protection as well, and so, privileges to travel. So one of the first places that I used the passport to travel to was Tibet, And in the beginning, we in my network in the office, none of us thought that I was going to get a visa to go to China. Forget about Tibet. And I also made some terrible mistakes. What I did was, when I filled out the application for the visa, I put the application in an envelope that was part of SFT's official envelope, wow. Students for Free Tibet official envelope. Because I was very green and stupid at the time, I made that mistake. And I sent it, and now everybody is even more pissed off. It's like, oh, okay, now it's over. This is not going to work. Because we had a team of, 5 to 7 people who were going to go, and I was the only Tibetan. Now it's all disaster. But as it turned out, it seems like in the Chinese consulate's visa office, there was somebody working there who was even more stupid than me. So they gave me the visa. And I managed to get a visa to go to China. I made my journey. And then from Chengdu to Tibet, I was able to, you have to get a permit, a special permit. Even though China says Tibet is part of China and all of that stuff, they treat Tibet like a separate country. So from China to Tibet, you actually have to get a special permit, and people don't get it. And I didn't get it. They said, I was with a white American woman, a colleague who was traveling with me, and 2 of us were going together to Mount Everest Base Camp to do a protest. But in Chengdu, the agency came back and said, she will get the special permit you want, but I'm not going to get the special permit. I said, why? They said, because you're Tibetan. So the logic was very funny and strange to us. Like, you cannot go to Tibet because you are Tibetan, Anyway, she was very resourceful. She was extremely smart, and she was able to, manage to find means to sneak me into Tibet. And that's how we were eventually able to go to Lhasa, spend a few days in Lhasa making the banners and everything, and eventually go all the way up to Mount Everest Base Camp, where we did the protest. And the goal of the protest was, the slogan on the banner we had was, "One World, One Dream, Free Tibet." And it was a spin on the Chinese Olympic slogan, which is "One World, One Dream," right? And our idea was to jam their slogan and jam their PR so that every time somebody, a Chinese official or diplomat or somebody says "One World, One Dream," the media and the diplomats and the policymakers and the global audience, they're all thinking Free Tibet, So that was our mission.
Extremely risky, though. Although you said you had some protection in terms of the passport. But Dorjee, in your experience, and we've seen how the Chinese operate, or at least we've heard about how they operate, has there been any attempt, say, to infiltrate into Tibetan refugee settlements, groups, by the Chinese to try and divide and rule again? I mean, outside Tibet or China.
I think China's influence globally, has grown so much.
Yeah.
And my experience, for example, in the United States, they're everywhere in the universities,
Right.
in the think tank, media. One example that we can give is Confucius Institute, right?
Yeah.
They say culture and religion or like language. But what they do is like expanding its influence, basically bringing its law to the free world.
Yeah.
So in the university, they make this contract, very shady contract, that university is supposed not to, put it out. And that contract says like they have to respect Chinese law. So that way, like I remember when I was in US working with students of Free Tibet, there were almost 110 Confucius Institute. Some institute get millions of dollars.
Yeah.
And this private institute directly deal with the Chinese government. And actually, how it run is directly from the Chinese Communist Party, right? Through different organization name. So yeah, we did a lot of campaign, as Tendo mentioned. It's still right now, Students of Free Tibet is one of the most active grassroots organization. And we're able to succeed. We succeeded pushing back. We kind of like, expose their, doing through teachers, parents, and through really like grassroots people and policymakers educating. Finally, I remember by the time of 2022, almost like 70 of them shut down.
Yeah.
Right? So that way we did it. As far as India, I personally feel like Indian government has been very cautious from very beginning. Like what happened recently with the Galwan, like almost banning like how many, like 50 plus apps, like, US still right now trying to follow that. But yeah, we are very cautious. We know that whether it's a physical, whether it's the cyber, like, Dharamsala has been targeted by Chinese government from very beginning. It's not a new thing, and we try to learn, we try to, as an activist elsewhere as well, like how to protect ourselves, both digitally and physically. So that way, yeah, they try to influence, and also they try to, censor the community, right? Especially like not giving visa, the reciprocal access to Tibet, all that part of their tactic. But yeah, we have been pushing back, and that's what we are trying to tell to the world, that, the resource, the network, the legitimacy that we have, we should push back together as a partner. Then only we can succeed. So yeah, Tibetans, whether it's the Uyghur, whether it's Hong Kongers, who are at the forefront, should be seen as a partner to really, defend our freedom. If we see that, I think there's a hope.
Yeah. It's not just bringing that point up repeatedly. Partnership not only say the US or India and other countries, but say the repression among the Uyghurs, Hong Kong, even Taiwan to an extent. If it comes as a concerted push, maybe. But I also wanted to ask you. I mean, Dorjee mentioned how the Lama is doing much better, recovering after his surgery, and I think he himself, he is always joking, right, in a childish manner. He himself has talked about this when he's asked numerous times that he will live till 113, and we all wish him the longest life. But the issue of the succession of the Dalai Lama and how China is trying to usurp that and how dangerous that is, how is that process being worked out towards?
So, as you said, the Chinese government, and His Holiness has often joked about the fact that the Chinese government is more interested in His Holiness's reincarnation than His Holiness himself. And reincarnation is not just a religious matter; it's a very personal matter, And people in India understand. People in Tibet understand, because we believe in that. We believe in rebirth. We believe in the law of karma. We believe in the process of reincarnation, how it happens. There was a whole system, there was a whole knowledge system and a theory behind how this process takes place. And the fact that for the Chinese government, which is an atheist regime that is declared its position as the enemy of religion. Religion is poison to them. And all sorts of religious beliefs are anathema to the Chinese government. And after attacking religion and after attacking Buddhism and the Buddhist institutions and the monastic institutions and the faith system of the Tibetan people for 70 years, now they want to talk about reincarnation. It has no value. Nobody's going to believe it. It has absolutely no legitimacy. And they're making a fool of themselves in that sense. Okay. And I think the more important thing really here is His Holiness. There is no other leader who has been as successful in leaving a legacy of democracy, of nonviolence, of advocacy for the Tibet issue. And I think His Holiness, starting from the first day that he set foot on Indian soil, his vision was clear. His vision, and back in those days, democracy was not even very popular. Right? There were many countries that were not democratic in those days. So some people talk about how the Tibetan government democratized as a strategic move toward getting more international support. And there was not a lot of evidence to back up that claim, actually. The real history, if you look at the data, if you look at all the historical evidence and the sequence of events and the decision making, it's very clear that His Holiness, even before he left Tibet, he already had a vision of what a future democratic free Tibet should be like. And as soon as he set foot in India, he started working on setting up the institution, establishment of the Tibetan government in exile, with a parliament, with an executive branch, with a judiciary branch, And right now, in spite of all the problems we have, all the shortcomings that we have, and I know as in the exile government, we have many shortcomings, just like other real governments of, sovereign nations. Sovereign nations have more problems than us, right? And I think His Holiness basically throughout the course of these 60 years, the way he has invested in institutional, secular Tibetan government leadership in exile, not just to lead the people in exile, but to be a leader and a voice for the entire Tibetan population in Tibet as well as globally. I think the success is very clear. Whether you go to America, whether you go to Australia, whether you go to Tibet, any of the remote villages in Tibet, whether you go to Tibetans who live in Beijing or Shanghai, not to mention India, if you ask them, who is your government? Who is your legitimate representative? Every single person will say, the Tibetan government that is based in Dharamsala is my real government. And I think that is the greatest success, greatest legacy that His Holiness has left to the Tibetan community.
It's a masterstroke. I mean, when he separated religious and spiritual powers from political and democracy. I also wanted to ask you, in terms of the struggle of 70 years now, is there a group of, say, the youth who are restless, who are impatient, because you both talked about non-violence as, the means to the end, who want to take up an armed struggle? Is there, how big is it? Is it there?
So I think first it's important to recognize what Tendor mentioned about the democratic institution, and I get to see one or two Indian intellectuals have written some article recently and mentioned about the question you asked, something could this happen, what not. But you need to hear what is the Tibetan voice, right? His Holiness' legacy is the hope for freedom. And His Holiness has said the issue of Tibet is not about His Holiness. It's about the 6 million Tibetan. And as long as there is a repression, there is a resistance. We know that. And that's why right now Tibetan people inside continuously rejecting China's occupation. And of course, it's a very difficult, subject to discuss. And we truly hope and believe in His Holiness. And His Holiness said, we can hope for the best, but prepare for the worst, right? So, if that time comes, of course, it will further distance Tibetan from the Chinese government. And Tibetans, as His Holiness said, he has involved his political authority, and we have elected leader. And we discussed about the Resolve Tibet Act. And with the recent development, there are also some concerning voice, which I can understand, with its relation with the U.S. in the past, that because of China-U.S. relation, now U.S. is doing this and that. But we have to understand there is a changing geopolitics. But what is the Tibetan role in that? So as Tendor mentioned about the campaign group like ICT, the exile government leadership here, we discussed a lot within the parliament as well. We have re-strategized how to strengthen our position. So actually what is happening right now in US is actually a re-strategized work of Tibetan leadership. And His Holiness has traveled to US after almost 7 years, right? First time, and with his age, we want him, of course, to rest and, have the space. He has worked all his life, but this new generation of Tibetans, right, both born inside and outside, he's taking this movement leadership at the next level.
Right.
That's why we are seeing that, right? So we are clear in our goal, right, in our path. So that Tibetan voice need to be recognized. And India clearly understand, and we know that as we communicate, we understand that. But there's still anxiety in the Tibetan community. What will happen after Dalai Lama, right? So therefore, there should be more clarity. I feel like from the government of India, on the position of reincarnation, it's a Tibetan right. There's no caution. Why can't we say it clearly? Right? It's a Tibetan choice, Tibetan's right. It's a religious right. Country and government which believe in all the secular, democracy. Why can't we say that? Why we are so fearful, or how China will, react? China will do what they want to do, but we have to do that. So the recognition that we give to the legitimate government in exile that Tibetan people believe should be strengthened, right? The first thing that U.S. Congress delegation came visiting the Tibetan Parliament, right? So I was there at that time. So that gives a legitimacy. And we know that India has a political history, culture, civilization, right? And we believe, we are grateful for that. But now it's time to step up, right? If India steps up, because even in US and West, they're also at the same time waiting what India is doing, right? So on that reincarnation issue, I feel like there should be more clarity for the public so that there is no anxiety. And it's a response to China that they don't have any right. And at the end, it's about the religion, it's about the personal choice. No matter what China do, there may be caution China will do this and that, right? It will not succeed because it's a Tibetan choice, it's a Tibetan voice, it's a Tibetan right. So that way, from the religious point of view, under His Holiness leadership, all the schools of Buddhists, like recently there were meetings, we are all united. And nobody need to worry, what is the process? It has been in the process over the last 500 years, practice. So Tibetans will do that. But what we need is the global support in countering China's false claim. So that need to be there. And then from the political side, we have this democratic institution, Tibetan government in exile, how we can strengthen that.
Tendor, if you want to just round that up, because all the points that Dorjee has also brought up, say if you're talking about the bipartisan congressional delegation that came here, post that, they came to Delhi.
Yes.
And then the Prime Minister met them and publicized it. So, I mean, NSA Doval was also present. External Affairs Minister Jaishankar also met them. So, I mean, whether it's symbolic or not, in terms of what India can do, Dorjee also mentioned, say, in Geneva, if India could raise its voice as well, and the issue of the succession. What should India be doing? Or should it be changing its policy? Because China's torn up every agreement that India and China, after Galwan, I mean, none of them were.
Right. I really agree with what Dorjee just said about how India's time has come. India is now a global leader. It doesn't have to wait for a higher status or wait for more power. I think sometimes you build more power by taking action. Sometimes you wait for power and then take action. But a lot of times in this day and age, in this interdependent world, you actually build power by taking action, right? And I think the US now has a very clear recognition that India is indispensable as a global leader. The world, whether people like it or not, and I know lots of people don't like to see things in a binary way between autocracy and democracy or dictatorship and liberalism. But the fact is the world has gone into two camps. There is the camp of the free world, and many of the democracies are challenged. They undergo lots of problems, fine. But there is democracies and the free world on one side, and there is the dictatorships on the other side. And India and the US are the two most important leaders in this camp. And it's inevitable and it's unacceptable at the same time, right? It's inevitable that the US and India has to work together. There's no other way. And I think strategic ambiguity, I know Indian government and Indian policymakers, they appreciate the importance and they prefer strategic ambiguity on many issues of national security, of border security, China-India relations. Strategic ambiguity has its value. It has a place. At the same time, I think strategic clarity also has a value. Moral clarity has so much value. And at a time when many major powers in the world are seeing some decline in their moral authority or legitimacy, I think the Indian leadership, I think the Indian government and India as a civilizational state carries so much soft power. I think nobody can compare to India's soft power and moral authority. I know it goes up and down, and still there's no comparison with China, right? And I think in that sense, it is time to tap into this vast reserves of moral authority, moral legitimacy, and use it in order to strengthen it. And I think for the Tibet movement, if the Tibet movement grows in strength, if the Tibet movement gets more recognition and legitimacy, I think it puts China on the back foot. It puts China in a weaker position. And right now, there was no way, there was no world, or there was no possibility where stability in the relationship between India and China will bring greater security for India. I think that fiction is over. That time is up. And the United States also recognizes that the previous 30 years of its policy of engagement and believing that China will liberalize and then it will democratize and then it will be a responsible member of the international community. All that fiction has come to an end now. And I think moving forward, I think the world will be much more peaceful, much more free, and much more democratic if we see a new chapter. And of course, there is no denying the fact that among all the countries in the world, nobody has done more for the Tibetan cause and the Tibetan people than India. Not just in the last 70 years, over the last 1,000 years. And as the reality often shows, we always go to those who have helped you most and asked for more support, right? And just like that, Tibetans also go to India is the place we go to, right? And I also want to recognize that in the United States as well as in India, there are people who are morally, genuinely dedicated to the Tibetan cause and the Tibet issue with no side agenda. There are many people. At the same time, there are also some people who see Tibet as a card, as a geopolitical card that we are going to use. And what I would say is, if you see the Tibet issue as a moral issue, a humanitarian, political, moral issue of our time, and support the Tibetan people to reclaim their right to self-determination, we are always grateful. And to those who may see Tibet as a card to play, we don't hold it against you. We just say, play it well, please. Play it well. Don't squander it. Don't waste it. It's one of the most important geopolitical issues in this great game of major powers. And we Tibetans, we are also playing this game. We are also, we are not only pawns in a great game. We are actors on a global stage, and please recognize us as doing that. And I think a new collaboration and coordination between the United States and India and Tibet, I think that can actually bring us into a new chapter of hope.
Again, I thank you both so much for your time and such a comprehensive discussion. Thanks again.
Thank you so much,
More
Amitabh.
strength to the
Thank you.
Tibetan cause.
Yeah. Blessed.
And just for our viewers, do send us feedback on this particular interview that we've had with Dr. Tenzin Dorjee Tendor, as we call him, and also with Dorjee Tseten. You can also follow all our social media sites for the latest that we put up on our website or interviews like this. This is StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Brevi.